With the toxic fallout and volcanic ash settled, the group were excited to get on with their work, eager to escape this planet as soon as they could. In order to speed up their efforts, their new teammate Woog introduced the group to a new idea, utilising their tardigrades as mounts to help speed up their travel around the site. While the group couldn't argue with the effectiveness of this strategy, they just didn't love the idea. Although Woog's sales pitch was probably hindered a little by his being naked whilst he showed off how to mount the beasts. The group quickly put the finishing touches on the perimeter wall, securing the site and making it much more defensible. With another trade ship passing overhead, Trev was quick to spend some of their accumulated silver on some medicine and components, both of which were proving to be valuable commodities around the site. Although the wild tardigrades had been feasting well thanks to the cleaning mechanoids dumping polluted materials on the ground, it seems as though one of them had let their greed get the better of them. Angry that the mechanoids were working so slowly, the tardigrade decided to start attacking them. Tim heard the commotion from his shack and ventured out to deal with the issue. Unfortunately, his remarkably poor aim meant that the tardigrade was able to incapacitate 2 of the mechanoids and damage a third before Tim was finally able to land enough shots to put it down. Erison wouldn't be pleased at the extra work he'd have to do to repair the mechanoids due to Tim's incompetence. The next morning saw Wood putting the finishing touches on the perimeter wall, eager to show the group that despite his initial attempt to attack them, he was now dedicated to their safety and security. In fact, he even suggested an improvement to the entrance at the site, extending the entrance further to the west to force any attackers down a corridor of death, where the group could lay down a continuous stream of bullets upon them. After the experience of constructing the perimeter wall, the group were working like a well-oiled machine, and had the new structures built in no time. With the components they'd bought, Erison suggested investing some of them in a ground-penetrating scanner, so that they could source more steel and components, allowing them to be more self-sufficient without having to wait for passing traders to replenish their supplies. With the north section of the site now officially free of pollution, Trev spent the night planning out the next section of the site for the mechanoids to focus on. Given the presence of another naturally pollution-free zone to the south, he set Erison the task of cleaning a rather ambitious section, which would bring them a lot closer to their goal, but which would likely take the mechanoids quite some time to achieve. The mechanoids wasted no time getting to work, starting with cleaning the pollution from the tox potato field, which naturally killed off the tox potatoes which relied on the polluted material to grow. Given their current food stockpiles, this was as good a time as any to switch away from the tox potatoes for sustenance. Besides, they'd already cleared plenty of other areas where they could plant nicer crops, if needed. The new defensive structure soon got its first test, albeit a very light test, in the form of a couple of rabid toxalope. The group rushed to the defences to join in, but even in their absence, the turrets made a good start on bringing the beasts down. Given the slow speed at which the group managed to make it to the defences, the toxalopes did get closer than anyone would have liked. Whilst they managed to deal with the issue without injuries, it didn't fill them with hope for how well the defences would stand up against humans with guns and explosives. As it had been the very first field they planted, the group felt an attachment to the tox potato field. So, as it slowly became unusable for tox potatoes as the mechanoids began removing the pollution, they began to replant it with tomatoes, finding joy in the new life that they'd given to the soil during their time here. Trev was still feeling the mental strain of the recent events, and in a particularly peculiar breakdown, he dug up the corpse of poor Lola and tried to present it to the group on the dining table. Thankfully Tim, still feeling guilty over what had happened with Fur, and thus responsible for Trev's poor mood, was able to rush into the shuttle and remove the corpse before it could upset too many of the group. Tim wasn't necessarily wrong to feel responsible. Although the group all understood the unfortunate nature of what had happened, his resentment for Tim was still weighing heavily upon Trev, who he still blamed for the death and whose continued presence was causing Trev extra stress. Erison had thought he was done with research for the time being, but after seeing how close the Toxalope had gotten to the defences, Lug implored him to research how to create more powerful turrets to cover the entrance to the site, so that they could be more certain of their safety, even if the group were far away from the defences when an attack arrived. As if on cue, another group of attackers showed up in the local area. This time, however, they seemed intent on sitting back and launching mortar shells at the site. A lucky mortar strike on the shuttle could render unflyable, something the group couldn't let happen. In an effort to force the attackers to abandon their encampment and charge the site, giving the group the benefit of their defensive positions, Trev grabbed his charge sniper and headed to the outskirts of the perimeter wall to begin taking shots at the attackers. The first mortar flew true and struck right in the centre of the shuttle, damaging their storage shelves and also setting fire to the bridge, which also contained 2 of the chemfuel storage tanks. In an effort to prevent the whole shuttle becoming an inferno, the whole group rushed in to try and extinguish the flames. Thankfully, with the full crew working together, they were able to get the flames under control, even as more mortar shells flew overhead. Not long after the third shell landed, the constant sniper fire from Trev convinced the attackers that their position wasn't safe, and they began charging towards the site. As Trev retreated back through the perimeter wall, the rest of the group took up positions at the defences and awaited the attack. Robbed of their initial plan to lay siege to the site, the attackers rushed headlong into the defences without a plan, allowing the group to rain bullets upon them as they approached one by one. Despite some initial success, once the main body of the attacking force arrived, they were able to get dangerously close to the group before they could take them down. Thankfully, despite getting close, they'd also taken a lot of damage, and those who were still standing soon routed. It was a successful demonstration of the site's new defensive structure, but perhaps not quite as successful as had initially been hoped. The group captured and patched up one of the attackers, Wolf, hoping to convince them to join and thus increase their workforce. They shortly realised though that, as well as having lost an arm during the fight, their captive was also a waster, with a psychoid dependency and an alcohol addiction. Deciding that Wolf seemed like they'd be more trouble than they're worth, the group instead decided to simply patch her up and send her on her way, hoping that it'd maybe buy them some goodwill with at least one of the local factions. As if sensing the group's desire to expand their workforce, however, a wanderer, Nicole, approached the site and asked to join. Nicole was used to doing technical tasks, and with Erison back to researching, they could use someone to man the ground-penetrating scanner to scan for minerals, so they welcomed Nicole into the team. Of course, the arrival of Nicole meant the creation of another new shack to house her in, which the team were becoming quite adept at throwing together at this point. The next day was blessedly quiet, allowing the group to spend the day honing their marksmanship, whilst Erison studied and the mechanoids got on with cleaning. Following a trade with a passing ship that allowed them to offload a bunch of miscellaneous items in exchange for some advanced components, Erison announced that he'd finished his research into larger, more effective turrets to man the defences. And, not long after, Nicole announced that she had found the first underground steel deposit. Unfortunately, the steel deposit was too far outside the safety of the perimeter wall to be worth trying to retrieve, but it was a nice reassurance that Nicole knew what she was doing when it came to the scanning. The next day though, the seemingly constant orbital turmoil above this planet gifted them a meteor of steel that landed just outside the wall, more than making up for the awkward position of the underground deposit. The mechanoids, as always, were still working away in the background, slowly but surely inching closer to connecting the current clean area with the naturally pollution-free zone to the south. The days had gotten quite quiet, but seemingly concerned by the lack of issues, Tim and Ferry got into a fistfight. It's unclear what started it, but they both claimed it was just a simple social fight. although the bite marks on Ferry's arm and torso suggested it had been quite an aggravated one. As a storm broke out overhead, the group spotted the approach of another Prestigator. Eager to avoid having it sneak up on someone at a later date, they decided to be proactive about putting it down. As the two nearest, Erison and Will took up positions on either side of the lumbering beast and let loose with their weapons. With their advanced weaponry, the beast stood no chance against them, and they took it down before it could cause any injuries to them. That's not to say, of course, that no injuries were incurred. Unfortunately, the nearby turret had recognised the angry Prestigator as a target and attempted to join in. But with its poor targeting systems, it instead led to it repeatedly striking poor Will, piercing multiple holes in his chest and puncturing his lung. He would live, but being shot by your own defence system was a pretty unfortunate reason to wind up in a hospital bed. Especially as the wound soon got infected, meaning he really would need to be confined to his bed for a while. Well, he should be at least, but following the disaster of the last few days, he had a breakdown and began wandering the site instead of resting in his bed. With Woog already being in a catatonic state following a previous breakdown, it seemed that the locals were trying to seize on the opportunity to attack the group whilst two of their people were incapacitated. Two groups approached, but as they lay in wait outside the perimeter, planning their attack, the group sallied forth from the perimeter wall and charged the attackers to the north, looking to make quick work of them and thin the attacking force considerably. Conscious that there were two groups of attackers, the group didn't want to put themselves in too much danger handling only one of them, so they held a decent distance and let Trev pick them off. It took a bit of time, but they were eventually able to take out the first group with no injuries to themselves, scattering the attackers. Returning to the site, they didn't have to wait long for the second group to begin their charge. Having dealt with the first group so handily, the defenders were feeling quite confident as they made their way to the defences. The attackers again chose to simply rush the defences, hoping to get inside the wall and past the turrets before firing their own weapons. The defenders initially thought that this was a silly tactic, as it allowed the defenders free rein to pile bullets into the attackers. However, one of the attackers who managed to make it through this gauntlet had a little surprise in their pocket, in the form of a triple rocket launcher. Before the defenders knew what was happening, 3 rockets soared towards them, the first going wide and the next 2 tearing into the centre of their lines. Luxembourg took the brunt of the hit, her whole body being shredded and snapped by the impact. Nunez and Tim both took heavy damage too, but Nunez ignored her own injuries to rush in and try and drag Luxembourg to safety, whilst Tim charged the attacker who had unleashed the barrage, fully intending to rip off their arms and beat them to death with them. The rest of the group held their positions, trying to stop any more of the attackers getting close and taking advantage of the chaos. Thankfully, the rest of the attackers soon saw the writing on the wall and began to flee. In the interests of not bleeding out, Tim gave up his chase, but eager not to let the attacker get away, Erison took up the chase in his stead. Their new teammate Nicole ran over to try and stabilise Tim, who'd already lost a lot of blood. Nunez managed to get Luxembourg to her shack before retreating to her own, whilst Erison, fresh off of killing the rocket-launching maniac, rushed into Luxembourg's room to try and staunch the bleeding. In the chaos following the rocket launcher attack, Ferry and Trev had also taken some hits, fending off the rest of the attackers. With Woog still catatonic, and Will being bedbound with his infection, they were short on people to perform medical work. Despite the extensive damage, Erison's practiced medical expertise allowed him to stop Luxembourg's bleeding, stabilising her for the time being and allowing him to move on to treating Trev, whilst Nicole rushed over to try and save Nunez. Trev's injuries were blessedly quick to treat, so Erison soon ran over to finish tending Tim's wounds, a task made harder by his breakdown following the attack. With Tim now stable, Erison then bolted to the shuttle to treat Ferry. Seconds after stopping Nunez's bleeding, Nicole also suffered a mental breakdown, for which no one could really blame her. It'd been a hell of a night. With Erison being the only uninjured, cognizant member of the team left, It looked like they had just about saved everyone. But as he rushed around the site, he stumbled upon Will, dead upon the ground. In all the chaos of the attack, they'd failed to keep a close eye on his infection, and he'd ultimately succumbed to it. Despite all their hard work over the night, they couldn't manage to save everyone. To no one's surprise, one of Luxembourg's many injuries became infected. Spurred on by failing Will, Nunez wasted no time in treating the wound, even whilst everyone else lost their mind around her. Tim soon joined in the fun with an infection of his own. And whilst a mentally unstable Trev murdered some of the group's tardigrades, Luxembourg received a second infected wound. Thankfully, murdering the two tardigrades seemed to be exactly what Trev needed to get his mind right, allowing him to be stable enough to contact a passing trader and secure some more medicine for the group, which they were sure to sorely need in the coming days. That single barrage from the rocket launcher had really caused a cascade of issues for the whole group, and with Erison also breaking down, things were going to be remarkably slow for the next few days. That evening, Luger rose from his catatonia to see the devastation of his teammates. He almost wanted to go straight back to bed, but Nicole dragged him back into the world, demanding his help to keep things moving. Luxembourg's infections were looking pretty bad, but Nunez was keeping a close eye on her and doing everything she could. Tim was starting to get the upper hand on his infection at least, but the two would be contained to their beds for a while to come. After a night of good rest, most of the team were stable, physically at least. Mentally they were all struggling a bit, but at least they could start working to improve their situation again. Only Luxembourg was still bedbound, with her infections still looking dangerous. Thankfully, utilising the medicine they'd bought, Nunez had been able to work some miracles, and it looked like Luxembourg might just pull through. With most of the group back on their feet, they decided that they needed to bury Will, to help the group put the attack behind them. Nicole dragged him to a grave, but they forwent a funeral for the time being, with everyone more intent on cleaning up the mess and recovering from their injuries. As Tim cleaned up their shack, Luxembourg's immune system finally started to pull ahead of her infections, and the group finally allowed themselves to feel hopeful about her condition. The mental wounds were still fresh though, and clearly harbouring a grudge since their fight where Tim had bitten him, Ferry decided to try and kill Tim. Unwilling to see all their hard work from the last few days undone by the untimely death of Tim, Nunez, Woog and Nicole banded together and laid a beatdown on Ferry, stopping him dead in his tracks. By the following morning, the group were out of the woods, and Erison was able to check in on the progress of the mechanoids, who'd been working away diligently the whole time, and had almost finished cleaning their currently designated area. And, speaking of the cleaning task, the group were soon bringing in their first harvest of tomatoes from their newly unpolluted field. In case of future sieges, the group had ventured out and reclaimed the mortars that the previous siege had left behind. They set them up inside the perimeter wall, hoping to use them to handle any further sieges they may face in the future by returning fire. With this planet proving so dangerous, the group finally decided it was time to plant some medicinal herbs of their own. These wouldn't be as effective as proper medicine, so they would endeavour to keep a good supply of that from passing traders. But in a pinch, the herbal medicine would be a significantly better alternative to no medicine at all. With the mechanoids finishing up their current task, Erison allowed them a day cleaning up the blood and guts from the site, before setting them to work on the next section of pollution they needed to clean. Once this section was completed, the group would be well on their way to completing their task. The next few days were blessedly quiet, allowing the group to fully recover both mentally and physically from the last attack. Of course, no sooner had the tension begun to leave their bodies and minds than the planet decided another cold snap was required. With all of their shacks already outfitted with heaters, there was little the group could do about it. They would likely lose their crops, but they had a decent amount already harvested and in storage, so they tried not to get too worked up about the cold weather. The only step they really took was having Trev get to work making warm parkas for all of them, to help withstand the cold whilst working outdoors. Erison had been working away on a new project in the background, and he soon informed the rest of the team that he'd figured out a way to fabricate their own components from all the steel they had. It would require a new workbench, but Trev was only too happy to work with him to expand the workshop, in order to allow them to fit the new bench in. Of course, while they were planning to build anew, the planet was planning to tear it down, as it sent a pack of angry boom rats to the crew. The boom rats managed to get the drop on Nicole, gnawing at her, and then having the audacity to die near her, setting her alight. The group managed to thin the numbers of boom rats before Erison rushed in to beat out the flames and get Nicole home for some medical treatment. The group finished up the final boom rats and then got to work containing the resultant flames. With the whole group working hard, the workshop expansion was soon done, allowing them to more easily replenish their component stockpiles, which would be vital if they wanted to build more automated defences. And, speaking of defences, it wasn't long before the locals laid siege to the site once more. Forgetting all about the mortars they'd set up inside the walls for just such an occasion, Trev and Ferry, who now both had sniper rifles, sallied forth and launched rounds at the attackers from a distance. It turns out that trying to hit targets at a distance in the dead of night is quite difficult though, and the two of them have trouble goading the siege encampment into charging the defences. Thankfully, the mortar rounds weren't too accurate either. Nevertheless, Trev and Ferry kept at it, and after a lucky shot took out one of the mortar emplacements, the attackers abandoned their mortars and began charging. Although it was the dead of night, the group made their way to the defences, hoping and praying that this fight went smoother than the last one. As the attackers sprint down the entry into the site, one makes it all the way before unleashing a toxic cloud of gas to cover him. Unfortunately for this attacker, Tim is nearby and wearing a gas mask. Knowing how poor his aim is, Tim forgoes his shotgun in favour of trying to run in and beat the attacker instead. This is a somewhat sensible idea which is rendered less effective given that he takes multiple shots whilst trying to close the distance. Whilst one of the attackers sprays liquid napalm all over the defences, the group struggle to try and land effective hits against their targets. Knocking the already weakened Tim to the ground, his attacker then begins advancing on the rest of the group. Within moments, chaos is taken over once more, as Erison, Nicole and Tim are all down, whilst Nunez and Woog are already bleeding. While Nunez tries to get Nicole to safety, Ferry and Woog head south to take out the attacker down there, removing the immediate threat and allowing Woog to try and treat the badly bleeding Tim. One of the attackers has brought a long-range weapon, which allowed him to fire from outside the group's effective range. In order to deal with this, Ferry slipped out the side door in the perimeter wall to get close and hunt him down. Unfortunately, the attacker had also brought a rapid-fire weapon, which he switched to just as Ferry approached, and used to land a good few hits on Ferry. As Ferry pulled back to cover, the attacker decided to charge the defences to get away from him. This charge, however, put him in the range of the turrets. The attacker stopped to trade fire with the turrets, and whilst his back was turned, Ferry edged out from his hiding place and began firing at him too. In the end, the attacker managed to take out one of the turrets, but Ferry made sure he paid the price on his way out. As Luxembourg rushed to help the bleeding Erison, the group realised that their ordeal was not yet over. A group of 4 attackers had also broken down one of the doors in the perimeter wall and gotten inside the site. To the group's relief, this second set of attackers were currently distracted trying to kill the cleaning mechanoids. Given the chaos of the evening, the group were happy to use the mechanoids as cannon fodder, in order to allow themselves some time to patch up their injured and figure out a game plan. Woog patches up Tim in the dirt, whilst Luxembourg tends to Nunez back in her shack, before moving on to Ferry. Nicole gets an infection, but they can deal with that once the immediate danger is over. Pretty soon, everyone's open wounds are patched, so blood loss isn't an issue. But most of them are in a lot of pain and still horizontal. Thankfully, the remaining group of attackers had taken enough damage engaging the mini turrets that had been left on that side of the site that they'd decided to leave, removing that issue from the group's to-do list. Watching the group firing wildly into the entryway and still managing to miss every attacker, Woog decided it was definitely time to bolster the defences, and began planning out 4 massive autocannon turrets to be aimed directly down the entryway. If the group couldn't aim, they'd have to rely on the computers to do it for them. At least with their new component production facility, they could create enough components to make it a reality. With their previous extensive experience of dealing with infections, Nicole's was soon brought under control, and so it seemed as though everyone would survive the chaos of the previous attack. The mechanoids had played their part as cannon fodder well, but they would need some repairs to keep them going. The new turrets would require some plasteel, but thankfully the group had stocked up on some earlier on in the mission, and any more that was required they could pick up from traders. Or, if they got really lucky, they might even find some buried underground that they could excavate. In fact, not long after this thought occurs to them, Nicole announces that she has found something underground. Unfortunately, it's not plasteel, but it is gold, and it's right under their stockpile, meaning they can easily excavate it and sell it to buy the plasteel they need. The group wastes no time in getting a deep drill up and running to start the work, and within the day, Tim and Nunez are taking turns extracting the gold from the ground. Once again, the planet decides to help the group by sending them some test targets, this time in the form of a pack of angry rats, which rush the entrance to the site, only to be met with bullets that are bigger than their entire bodies, ripping the ground apart and the rats along with it. It might be slight overkill, but at least the turrets are effective. With the site secured, the mechanoids are free to get on with their work, and are starting to make good progress once more. Nicole was even starting to help them out. It seemed that her experience during her short time as part of the group had heavily motivated her to get off of this planet as fast as possible. Following a few blessedly quiet days, the group are soon ready to task the mechanoids with clearing out a new section of the site. Feeling ambitious, they start the mechanoids clearing out the rest of the southwest of the site. Once that's done, they'll be dangerously close to finishing their task and getting off this rock. The locals, however, are not interested in giving them the chance to escape, and they appear on the outskirts of the site once more, looking to lay siege to the group. Once more forgetting about the existence of their own mortar placements, Trev and Ferry exit a perimeter wall and begin taking shots at the attackers, once more trying to goad them into attacking. Thankfully, they achieve their goal uncharacteristically quickly this time. As the defenders head towards the defences, they're surprised to realise that a number of the attackers had been able to get through the door in the perimeter wall to the east, before Trev and Ferry could close it. Thankfully, not all of the attackers got through the door before it closed, so the defenders choose to leave the autocannons to deal with any who make their way to the west, and they all head to handle the attackers who've infiltrated the perimeter. The mini turrets they'd left on the east of the shuttle, in case of drop pod raids, were doing a good job of exacting a toll on the approaching attackers. In the confusion of having to abandon their usual defensive line, Ferry and Woog forget to get into cover, and end up being gunned down by some fire. Nicole, having forgotten to bring her gun, charges in with a large stick and begins beating on one of the attackers with it. She is surprisingly effective, caving in the attacker's skull and causing the remaining attackers to flee at the site. Unfortunately, she also takes a few bullets in the process and hits the ground. As a whole, the group probably took more damage than they should have, but they had successfully dealt with another siege with no loss of life, or at least none of the group losing their life, so it was still a good success. Beating back the raid seemed to have earned the group a few days of respite. Work continued during this downtime, however, and they soon discovered a nice underground steel vein that was close enough to the walls to be worth excavating. Of course, no sooner had Tim started working on the steel mine than Trev's hatred reared its ugly head once more, and he attempted to murder Tim, This time though, Tim had had enough, and he decided to charge at Trev head on. Seeing the commotion, both Erison and Luxembourg stepped in to help Tim, beating Trev into submission before he could do any real damage. He had, however, taken some damage, with Tim using his ridiculous strength to actually rip off one of Trev's legs. It was unlikely to help him win over Trev, but it would at least give him something to remember Tim by the next time he thought about attacking him. Despite the stupidity of Trev's actions, the team needed him working, so Erison wasted no time in grabbing a nice sturdy stick from their ample wood supply and slamming it into Trev where his leg used to be, giving him a rudimentary peg leg. If Trev was lucky enough to survive the trip, and managed to bring back enough valuable materials, the corporation may see fit to outfit him with a new bionic leg before his next assignment, in order to keep him useful to them. The diligent work of the mechanoids meant that they were getting really close to finishing the task, so Trev might not have to wait very long to see about his potential new leg. Of course, the planet wasn't quite done with them yet, and a number of Thrumble which had entered the site suddenly went rabid, trying to attack the group. Thrumble were hardy creatures and tough to take down, so the group tried to gather together and unleash as much firepower as they could at once. Unfortunately, their path towards gathering together took them straight past one of the Thrumble, and it quickly laid out both Luxembourg and Erison. As it moved on to Woog, the rest of the group focused their fire on it. They weren't able to take it out before it floored Woog, but they weren't far behind. Blessedly, the second Thrumble had been distracted by one of the mechanoids, allowing the group to fire at it freely. That definitely could have gone smoother, but it also could have gone a lot worse, and the crew were just thankful that nobody had been injured beyond treatment. The mechanoids, backed up by the local tardigrades, soon finished clearing the southwest of the site, and with that, they were in the home stretch. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever it is, wherever you are. Tuna here just to thank you all for watching once more. This series is of course close to its end, as should hopefully be obvious from the mission progress screen at the end there. I'm still mulling over a couple of ideas for the next series, so if you have any suggestions for that, let me know down in the comments. I'm always happy to hear your guys' suggestions on what you think would make for an interesting series. After all, I make these to hopefully try and entertain you guys. Until next time, I hope you're looking after yourselves, and I hope you're enjoying the final few months of this year. Bye bye!